Hello, welcome back everybody. Today we have another exciting game that was played between David Bronstein and Leonid Stein. This game began with e4, c5, Ne3 D6, and c3. This is the delayed Alpin variation, and white intends to build up the center with the move d4. So black responds to this by playing knight f6, and now d4 is no longer playable due to knight takes e4. So instead, white plays queen c2, protecting the e4 pawn and once again intending to play d4. So now queen to c7 was played by black. And now d4 does not achieve its goals because after c takes d4 you cannot play c takes d4 because of queen takes c2. So instead white has to play knight takes d4 and he no longer has the pawn duo in the center. So instead white plays bishop b5 check, bishop d7, bishop takes d7, knight b takes d7, castles e6 and c4. A strategically correct move. White places his pawns on light squares because his light bishop has been exchanged off. Placing pawns on light squares will not obstruct his remaining dark bishop and will control the squares that his light bishop would have controlled. So now bishop to e7, knight c3, castles d3, a6, bishop g5, h6, bishop f4, and rook ab8. After this move, black's idea is to play the move b5 and get some play on the queen side. h3, b5, b3, b4, knight e2, knight e5, and now an interesting move, bishop takes e5. White exchanges off his remaining bishop for black's knight, which radically changes the pawn structure after black recaptures. And after the pawn structure has changed, this d-file is open for black to use and hit the backward d3 pawn. However, white has the two knights in a closed position, which generally favors the knights, and also black is left with a semi-bad bishop because most of his central pawns are placed on dark squares, but he may try to open things up later on in the game. So the game continued a3, and now white is threatening to capture the a6 pawn by playing a takes b4 and rook takes a6, so black responds by playing rook to b6. And now rook a2. White doesn't immediately open up the a-file with a takes b4 because after c takes b4, this c5 square is vacant and black may try to activate his bishop with bishop to c5. So instead he plays rook a2, knight d7, rook fa1, and now, once again, white is threatening to capture the b pawn and take a6. So black defends the a6 pawn by playing rook to d8. Because now on a takes b4, black can just play c takes b4, and if white captures the a6 pawn, then rook takes a6, and knight to c5, which forks the rook and the d pawn. So white defends the d3 pawn by playing knight to c1, and is once again threatening to capture the a6 pawn because rook takes a6, and knight c5 doesn't work because the knight on c1 protects d3. So black protects his a6 pawn by playing knight to b8, a takes b4, and now rook takes b4. Now in this position, black has two clear targets, the backward pawn on b3 and the backward pawn on d3. Queen c3, f6, and rook to a3. So now in this position, black realizes his worst placed piece is this knight on b8, but currently it can't move because it has the duty of protecting the a6 pawn. So in the next moves, he shuffles his major pieces around to protect the a6 pawn so that the knight can move. So he starts by playing rook to b6, queen b2, queen c8, queen a2, rook d7, rook a5, rook db7, queen e2, rook c7, rook 5a2, and knight to c6. The knight is finally free to move because he has sufficient protection of the a6 pawn. Rook d2, rook d7, rook d1, rook b8, h4, h5, and rook to e2. And now another great move by black, a5. This is a great move because when the pawn was placed on a6, the queen on c8 was tasked with defending it, and this was wasting a lot of its firepower. So after this advance, only the knight on c6 has to defend the pawn, and the queen is free to do whatever it wants to do. Knight e1, queen e8, knight c2, g6, rook a4, f5. Now here black is threatening to capture the h4 pawn, so queen to e3, because now if you capture h4, white can just capture c5, and now queen to f8. Now here, black is once again threatening to capture h4 because his queen on f8 protects c5, e takes f5, g3, rook db8, and rook to e1. I believe a better move would have been to play knight to e2 with some ideas of knight c3 followed by d5, because when the rook was on b8, it was putting pressure on the b3 pawn, but after black's last move of rook bd8, the pawn is no longer under pressure, so white could have freed up his knight there. So rook e1 was played instead, queen f6, rook a2, and bishop to f8. A great move. Black has some ideas of relocating the bishop to h6 and maybe exchanging off this important c1 knight, because this is the knight that is keeping both of white's weaknesses defended. So now rook f1 and king h7. Now black is actually threatening to play bishop h6 and bishop takes c1, followed by rook takes d3. Queen e1, and now bishop h6 can be met by knight to e3, so black plays f4 instead. Queen e4, and now f3. This pawn on f3 will be a thorn in white's position. Rook d1, bishop h6, and now knight to e1. The resource of knight e3 no longer works due to rook d4, and now the queen is trapped, so knight e1 was played instead. Rook f7, and now rook d4 is once again being threatened, so knight to c2 was played. Queen e6, and now black is threatening to win with queen h3 and checkmate on g2, so queen e1 was played. If white tried king h2, the problem is rook f4, g takes f4, queen g4, and there's no way to prevent black's double threat of queen g2 and bishop takes f4. So queen e1, knight b4, knight takes b4, a takes b4, rook a5, and now the winning break, e4. And now black has the unstoppable threat of e3. King h2, and now e3. F takes e3, bishop takes e3, d4, rook takes d4, knight d3, and black plays the move rook e4. He could have immediately won with the move rook takes d3, because after rook takes d3, bishop to g1. And after queen takes g1, black can play queen e2, king h1, and f2. And next move, he will promote and win the game. But rook e4 is played instead, queen f1, bishop d4, knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, rook takes c5, rook e2, and white resigned because he can't stop rook g2, and queen h3. I hope you enjoyed today's game, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.